Hi everyone, it's Kevin Annett. It's December 3rd, 2015, and I have yet another very important excerpt from my upcoming book, Unrelenting. It's entitled The Bone That Changed Everything, and it relates what happened in late 2011, early 2012, when I was invited by 10 traditional Mohawk elders to come to their community in Brantford, Ontario, to help uncover the remains of their relatives who as children had died or were killed at the Church of England's Mohawk Residential School, the oldest one in Canada. Let me begin by sharing a quote from the Brantford Expositor newspaper from November 30th, 2011. A media release from the Mohawk Nation today says that test archaeological pits dug on the grounds of the Mohawk School unearthed human remains described as a series of 16 bones, one of which is, quote, definitely human. The group says they won't allow police or government officials to confirm the find, quote, because of their complicity in the crime, unquote. And in my words, the old school building was still standing 40 years after it closed. It stared back at me, and I shuddered. It was the early spring when I first saw the Mohawk Indian School, and the new buds were turning the nearby forest a confusion of green. My companion had been interred in the building 60 years before. He couldn't bring himself to walk through the front door with me. They're over there, he gestured to the right of the school, where an unnatural rise in the earth suggested hastily piled soil. We had to go out at night and bury them. The priest said if we ever spoke about it, we'd be put in the ground too. Deterred from entering the old building by his behavior, I wandered with the aged Mohawk man to the side of the school. He gestured silently at the faded graffiti from unknown children that continued to bear witness from the worn brick walls of the place. "Help me," called out one of the scrawls from the past. "They used to put the bad kids down that hole," said the man quietly, gesturing again to an iron grating on the cement playground. "And some of them never came out of there alive." The man asked me not to identify him to anyone lest he catch shit, in his words. But that same day I met other local survivors who were bolder, starting with the 10 elders who had invited me there. The survivors called it the mush hole, according to popular thinking, because of the worm-filled mush the kids were forced to eat there. But Geronimo Henry, one of the survivors and witness, had a different explanation for the word mush. "You ever seen what a corpse looks like after a few months?" he asked me soon after we met. I told him no, but I also told him I had seen the hole. The Church of England had run the school since 1832 and it lasted until 1970. The purpose of the place was to lock up as many Mohawk children as possible and then, under the guise of education, to torture and kill them. Little bones, even entire skeletons, had been unearthed on the grounds by work crews over the years and had been dutifully shipped off to the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto or to the local Ontario Provincial Police, never to be seen again. The school building was still in use by the local tribal council and businesses who rented the place. Somehow these tenants were able to live alongside the tortured and restless spirits that clung to the place. "You can hear the little voices at night crying and screaming," said one woman at our first survivors gathering that was held in a local community center the night I arrived. "Those children need to come home," I replied. "We need to find their remains and give them a proper burial." Not all of the Mohawks in the room agreed. Many of them looked afraid. And as it turned out, they were not united. Some of them, like the elders who had invited me, wanted the crime to be fully exposed, beginning with the mass graves next to the school. Others were hostile to the idea. Those who were friends with the local government-funded Indians, like Bill Montour and the Six Nations Confederacy, tried from the very start to block our work and to attack me. Despite that, they did all agree that there was nothing wrong with talking it all over, and so they chattered inconclusively past midnight and on other nights, like a gaggle of windy clergymen. I learned quickly that their Grand River Mohawk community was permanently factionalized into at least 3 groups, the fault lines between them running back many decades to various age-old family disputes over who was the real tribal leadership. And the government and the Crown knew how to foster and exploit those divisions, and had done so from the very beginning, when the pro-British Mohawks had first been driven into Canada after the American Revolution. The Haldimand land tract that had been given to the Mohawks by the Crown in 1820 is today less than 1% of its original size, and the Mohawks are still squabbling over its little pieces. And yet the Crown and its churches had always worried about the traditionally proud and powerful Mohawk nation, whose leaders saw no need to sign treaties or dutifully ship their children off to the brainwashing and killing centers called Indian residential schools. When the Mohawk Institute opened in 1832, many of the Mohawks kept their children out of it, to the outrage of the staid Anglican churchmen who ran English Canada. And so in 1870, a secret agreement was signed between the Crown of England, the New England Company that ran the school, and various non-Mohawk tribes that set up the Mohawks themselves as the chief target for extermination. An elderly woman named Leona Moses actually saw this smoking gun document in 1998 in the Anglican Church archives in London, Ontario, when she was a researcher for that church. And after our locally publicized excavation at the Mushhole had begun in October 2011, Leona contacted and met with me and Elder Cheryl Squire, and she told us the whole incredible story. In her words, quote, "There are thousands of documents that can bring down the church. They show how our Mohawk children were being deliberately starved, tortured, and killed in the Mushhole for well over a century. But all the evidence is locked away in closed archives in something called the G12 collection at Huron College in London. Everyone is sworn to silence." I asked Leona if she saw any evidence that children were being buried near the school, and she nodded. "They're all over the place," she said. "They buried them on the grounds of the school, under the basement floors, even in the old furnace room. At least that's where they burned up a lot of them." Now, in an all too familiar scenario, we only spoke once with this key witness. A week after we met, Leona received a visit from London Anglican Bishop Bob Bennett, who threatened her with lawsuits and, worse, if she ever spoke with us again. Later, Leona's house burned to the ground suddenly one night, destroying the evidence she had purloined from the church archives, but which she had been too frightened to show us. And soon after that, Leona died herself. Again, quite unexpectedly. One of Leona's comments to us that day we had met intrigued me. At one point she had remarked, "They were experimenting on the children, and it's never stopped." Well, we were well into our survey of the Mushhole grounds by the time we met with Leona Moses. After we had acquired ground-penetrating radar by a local supportive company, that machine had revealed massive soil dislocations and mounds where survivors described burying children, or seeing such burials. And so as some of the Mohawks argued and the state-funded chiefs conspired how to shut us down, our elders-approved research team moved quickly to sink a test trench near the biggest mound, and we began the search for hard evidence. That evidence appeared almost immediately. There were 4 of us that day who found the first bones and the tiny buttons. Cheryl Squire led the group. She was the authorizing elder who insisted on being the first one to break the soil and commence the dig, which she did. Besides Cheryl Squire, there was myself, a young Mohawk man named John Henhawk, and one of my assistants, a white woman named Nicole. After laying our excavation rig out and digging down about 18 inches through pebbly soil, we unearthed clusters of bones and small brown and white buttons, these buttons being entangled in the roots of a nearby tree. And that was significant, as survivor and eyewitness Roberta Hill told us that week, quote, "They always planted a tree on top of every new grave of a child they buried. If you want to find their remains, let the trees show you where they are." Now, the buttons we uncovered were of a pre-1950 variety, not plastic, but made of wood, ivory, or bone. The bones were all aged, brown, and in some cases even cut and burnt, cut as if from a sharp instrument. One small bone seemed to draw me to it. It was a joint socket about 4 inches long. Later, it was positively identified by 3 different forensic experts as being most likely from the body of a small girl, probably around 5 years old. Greg Olson with the Ontario Provincial Coroner's Office said, while examining the socket bone, quote, "This is from a human. I'd stake my reputation on it," unquote. Later that week, Greg Olson and Dr. Chris Nargang of Trent University examined all 16 of the bone samples we unearthed, as we gathered in the community center together to examine the bones. They both studied the bones carefully for over an hour, and then they agreed that we had unearthed human bones mixed in with animal remains. That's not unusual in serial killer crime scenarios, commented Greg Olson. It's how they hide the evidence of their crime. Mix up the victim's bones with pig and cow bones from a local slaughterhouse. Their assessment was confirmed the next month by a leading world authority in forensic archaeology, Dr. Donald Ortner of the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C., to whom we had express mailed some of the bone samples, including the bone socket. I'd have to see more samples, he said, but you definitely have something there. He told me this over the phone the following week. Are any of them human? I asked him. I'd say so. I'm 90% sure about the socket bone, but I'd be happy to come up and work with the Indians in question if they want me there. Well, that was told to me in early January of 2012. By early April, Dr. Ortner was dead of an apparent heart attack. He was 71 and in excellent health, according to his wife. And both of the other consultants, Greg Olson and Chris Nargan, suddenly cut off all ties with us. Olson told me that his employer, the provincial coroner's office, had strictly forbidden him from working with us, even in his spare time. Eventually, the bone samples themselves vanished from the locked closet in the Mohawk Center where they'd been held. And by then, an enormous smear campaign had begun against me, using the usual effective divide and conquer methods. The campaign had been generated by the government-paid local chiefs. 8 of the 10 sponsoring elders backed off or were paid off, and our excavation was shut down by tribal police in the pay of government flunky Bill Montour. Nevertheless, the image of the little girl's bone remained, as had our work. The earth had finally been opened, and for the first time in history, a mass grave near an Indian residential school was exposed. And despite how the entire Canadian media ignored what we had found and ignored all of our press releases, the impact of what we'd opened was profound. You can read the complete report of what we discovered at itccs.org, our tribunal website, under the posting at the top listing the discovery of children's remains at Canadian Residential School. That's itccs.org. We'll go into more detail in future readings. This is Kevin Annett, and I thank you.